तो हेलो दोस्तों, स्वागत है आप सबका एक बार और H2 एड में। देखिए, इसी तरह की वीडियो के लिए जो है चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और वीडियो को लाइक ज़रूर कर दीजिए। चलिए देखिए, ये वाली जो सीरीज़ है इसमें जो रमेश सिंह द्वारा लिखी गई बुक है इंडियन इकॉनमी, ठीक है, उसको हम लाइन बाय लाइन पढ़ते हैं। ठीक है, आइए देखिए, चैप्टर 3 तक हमने कंप्लीट कर लिया था और ये 4th चैप्टर है इकोनॉमिक प्लानिंग का। तो इकोनॉमिक प्लानिंग वाला चैप्टर हम पढ़ ले रहे हैं। देखिए, कई लोगों के माइंड में अगर जो ये कन्फ्यूजन है कि रीडिंग ही क्यों करी जा रही है, देखिए पहले रीडिंग करेंगे उसके बाद से समझेंगे तो ज़्यादा आसान होगा, इसलिए मैं रीडिंग कर दे रहा हूँ कि आप भी एक बार बुक खोल के कम से कम सामने बैठे अगर जो तो एक रीडिंग हो जाए। ठीक है, इसके बाद देखिए डिस्कशन वाले जो वीडियोज़ होंगे, ठीक है, जिसमें समझाई जाएगी इंडियन इकॉनमी, वो कुछ आपके 10 चैप्टर वगैरह हो जाएंगे, उसके बाद देखिए रिलीज़ की जाएगी। तो इससे ये होगा कि आप एक बार रीडिंग कर लिए रहेंगे तो समझने में आसानी होगी। तो अभी 4th चैप्टर चल रहा है, तो आइए इसकी एक बार रीडिंग कर लेते हैं, फिर आगे का जो प्रोसेस होगा वो देखेंगे। तो देखिए, ये चैप्टर 4 और इकोनॉमिक प्लानिंग पे बेस्ड है। देखिए, इसमें ये दिया है कि चैप्टर में हमको क्या क्या पढ़ने को मिलेगा। इंट्रोडक्शन है, डेफिनीशन है, ओरिजिन एंड एक्सपेंशन ऑफ प्लानिंग और टाइप ऑफ प्लानिंग हमको देखने को मिल जाएगी। तो आइए सबसे पहले इंट्रोडक्शन देख लेते हैं। देखिए क्या कह रहा है Today, most of the world economies are planned. The world has seen major experimental breakthrough in the area of economic planning by now. India has been a planned economy right since its independence and continues to be so under the policy think tank Niti Aayog. This chapter intends to introduce the reader to measure what's, hows, and whys of the concept of economic planning, picking real example from the major planned economies of the world including India. Besides being a theoretical foundation to it aims to provide the theoretical anchor to planning in India. ठीक है, ये हमको चैप्टर 5 में देखने को मिलेगा। अब आइए डेफिनेशन देखते हैं। Whereas a number of definitions have been forwarded by different economists from time to time since the term planning entered the domain of the economics. To make us develop a clear understanding of planning, we need to see only a few of them, which will enable us to draw a working definition that fits contemporary times. The large number of the economists and experts have agreed that perhaps the best definition is given by H.D. Dixon, according to whom economic planning is the making of the major economic decision, what and how much is to be produced and to whom it is to be allocated by the conscious decision of determinate authority on the basis of comprehensive survey of the economic system as a whole. It was the National Planning Committee set up in 1938 by the Indian National Congress, which for first time that to define planning in 1940, though its final report was published in 1949. In India, it could be considered the broadest possible definition of the planning. Planning under the democratic system may be defined as the technical coordination by disinterested experts of consumption, production, investment, trade, and income distribution in accordance to social objectives set by bodies representative of the nation. Such planning is not only to be considered from the point of view of economics and rising of the standard of living, but must include cultural and spiritual values and the human side of life. By the late 1930s, there was an almost political consensus that independent India will be a planned economy. As India commenced economic planning by the early 1950s, the Planning Commission of India also went on to defining planning. According to Planning Commission, planning involves the acceptance of a clearly defined system of objectives in terms of which to frame overall policies is to involves it also involves the formation of strategy for promoting the realization of the ends defined. Planning is essentially an attempt at working out a rational solution of problem, an attempt to coordinate means and ends. It is thus different from the traditional hit and miss method by which reforms and reconstruction are often undertaken. In the post war period, A large number of the newly independent countries were attracted towards planning. Many new forces of the change kept refining the very idea of planning due to compulsive necessities of the industrialization or the issue of sustainability of the development process. But to carry forward our discussion, we need a working as well as a contemporary definition of planning. We may define it as a process of realizing well defined goals by optimum utilization of the available resources. While carrying out economic planning, the government sets developmental objectives and attempts to deliberately coordinate the economic decision making over a long period to influence, direct, and in some cases even control the level of growth of the nation's main economic variables, that is income, consumption, employment, saving, investment, exports, and imports. The economic planning is simply a set of specific economic targets to be achieved in a given period of time with a stated strategy. Economic plans may be either comprehensive or partial. A comprehensive plan sets target to cover all major aspects of the economy, while partial plan may go for setting such targets for a part of the economy, that is agriculture, industry, public sector. Taken broadly, the planning process itself can be described as an exercise in which the government first chooses social objective, then sets various targets, that is economic targets, and finally organizes a framework for implementing, coordinating, and monitoring the development plan. One very important thing which should be clear to all is that the idea of planning is first emerged in its applied form, and after studying and surveying the experiences of the different countries which followed it, experts started theorizing about planning. Thus, in case of planning, the direction has been from the practice to theory. This is why the form and the nature of planning kept changing from country to country and from time to time. As we see, as we will see in the following pages, the type of planning itself evolved through times as different countries experimented with it. As per our working definition, we may observe the following things about the planning. Planning is a process. It means planning is a process of doing something until we have some goals and objective left regarding our lives. The process might continue. With the changing nature of needs, the nature and scope of the planning process might undergo several changes. Planning is not an end in itself. As process accelerates and decelerates, change direction and course, so also does the planning. Second, planning must have well defined goals. After the Second World War, several countries opted for development planning. As these nations faced enormous socio-economic hurdles, they first set some goals and objectives and then started their process for realizing them via planning. In due course of time, there emerged a consensus that the planning must have some goals, and those goals should be well defined, not vagely defined, so that the government's discretionary invention in the economic organization could be democratically transparent and justified. Even in the non-democratic nation, that is erstwhile USSR, Poland, and China, the goal of planning were clearly defined. Third, optimum utilization of available resources. Here we see two welcoming concepts. First is the way of utilizing the resources. Till the idea of sustainability emerged 1987, experts tried to maximize resource exploitation. But once experts around the world introspected the untenability of such a method of resource utilization, the sustainable approach was included into planning, and herein entered the idea of utilizing resources at its possible best so that environmental degradation could be at its minimum and the future generation could also be able to continue with their process. Second is the idea of natural resources which are available. Resources, that is the natural as well as human, could be indigenous origin or exogenous. Most of the country carrying out planning try to utilize their indigenous resources, yet some tried to tap into the exogenic resources too, taking leverage of their diplomatic acumen. For example, the first country opting for the national planning, that is the Soviet Union, leveraged resources available in the East European countries. India also used exogenous resources for the development planning whenever it was necessary and possible to tap. By 1950s, planning had emerged as a method or tool of utilizing resources to achieve any kind of goal for policymakers around the world. First, trying to achieve a particular size of family for different countries came to be known as family planning. Second, the process of providing suitable physical and social infrastructure for the erstwhile or the upcoming urban areas came to be known as the town or urban planning. Third, the country trying to optimize the use of its revenues for different categories of expenditure came to be known as financial planning. Financial planning is more popularly known as budgeting. All budget all budgets, be it of government or the private sector, or are nothing but exercise of financial planning. Similarly, at the macro and micro level, there might be any number of planning processes: agricultural planning, industrial planning, irrigational planning, road planning, house planning, etc. Simply put, the art of achieving any kind of goal with use of the resources we have is the process of planning. We may cite a very general example. Students of a class are able to join the class at the right time, coming from the different places of their stay. How they are able to do so? All of them must be planning their time in such a way that they are able to join the class at the same time, though their places of residence are not at an equal distance from the class. All might be having their own ways of the time planning. Some might be having bed tea, some might not, some might be having breakfast at their place, yet others might think to take their breakfast in the college canteen, and so forth. It means that even if we are not consciously planning or have to announce it, we are always planning our days. The same is true in the case of countries. Many countries announce that they will be planned economics, yet some other did not opt for any such policy announcement. The Soviet Union, Poland, China, France, India are the example of former category, while the United States, Canada, Mexico fall in the later category. But here we are concerned with the conscious process of planning. There will be some methods, tools, and types of planning emerge through times as different countries will start their process of planning. Origin and expansion of planning. Planning is a method of achieving faster economic progress. It has been tried by different countries at different times and at different levels. We may see them as follows. First, regional planning. It was at the regional level that the planning was used as a part of development policy by any country for the first time. United States started the first regional planning after the Tennessee Valley Authority (TVA) was set up in 1916 for a large-scale rehabilitation in southeastern United States, covering part of the 7 states, with the primary aim of flood control, soil conservation, and providing electricity. The TVA, the regional plan, was also involved in many related activities such as industrial development, forestry, wildlife conservation, town planning, construction of road and rail, encouraging sound agriculture practices, and malaria control in the defined regions. The US experiments of the regional planning became such a success in realizing its well defined goals that it emerged as a role model and an object of the inspiration for many countries around the world. In the coming decades, the Damodar Valley Corporation (DVC) in India 1948, the Volta River Project in Ghana 1966, and so forth. National planning. The official experiment in the area of national planning is rooted in the Bolshevik Revolution of the Russia 1917, the Soviet Union. Dissatisfied with the pace of industrialization, it was in 1928 that Joseph Stalin announced its policy of central planning for the Soviet Union, the collectivization of the agriculture and forced draft industrialization were other radical new policy initiative announced by the Stalin. Besides economic planning in 1928, the Soviet Union went for its first five-year plan for the period 1928 to 33, and the world was to have its first experience of the national planning. The famous Soviet slogan Great Leap Forward was initiated for the rapid industrialization through the introduction of economic planning at the national level. The nature and the scope of Soviet planning, called the Ghost Plan, will have its direct or indirect bearing on all those countries which opted for the economic planning, be it state or capitalist or mixed economy. India was to have a direct influence of the Soviet planning on its planning process. In the first Soviet plan, heavy industries were favored over light industry, and the consumer goods were the residual sector after all other priority has been met. We see the same emphasis in the Indian planning process. The Soviet model of economic planning spread to the East European countries, especially after the Second World War, and found its purest form of such planning in the People's Republic of China in 1949. During the early 1940s, the concept of national planning was borrowed by France, and the world saw national planning being initiated by here to capitalist economy as well as by the non-centralized political system, that is democratic system. France started economic planning at the national level after announcing itself a mixed economy types of planning. After the first national planning was started by the Soviet Union, many more countries followed it, but with variation in their method and practices. Though there are many variants of planning, the most important one is on the basis of type of economic organization, that is state economy, mixed economy. During the course of evolution, planning based upon the type of economic system prevent, prevalent in country has been classified into two types. First, imperative planning. The planning process followed by the state economies, that is socialist or the communist, is known as the imperative planning. This is also called directive or the target planning. Such planning had two main variants. In the socialist system, all economic decisions were centralized in the hand of the state with the collective ownership of resources except labor. In the communist system, that is China of the past, all resources were to be owned and utilized by the state, including labor. Thus, communist China was the purest example of such planning. In the case of the Soviet Union, a little bit of market did exist. Even after the collectivization of agriculture was enacted by Stalin in 1928, only 94% of the Soviet peasants could be included in the process. Basic features of such planning are as follows. First, numerical targets, that is quantitative, for growth and development are set by plans as for example 5 lakh tons of steel, 2 lakh tons of cement, 10,000 kilometers of national highways, 5,000 primary schools, and so forth will be produced or built in the coming 5 or 6 years. Second, as the state controls the ownership of right over the resources, it is very much possible to realize the above cited plan targets. Third, almost no role for the market, no price mechanism, with all economic decision to be taken in the centralized way by the state government. Fourth, no private participation in the economy, only the state plays the economic role. The command economies followed the kind of planning, that is why this kind of planning, that is why such economies are also known as centrally planned economies. The USSR, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Romania, and finally China. Basically, it was the migration of some of the great economists from the Soviet bloc countries to Britain and the United States that a proper study and the discussion is started on very nature and pose of planning in the command economies. Many of these economies went back to their countries of origin after the Second World War to serve and in some measures suffer the revolution there. It was their articulate and contemporary economic thinking which formed the basis for the idea of mixed economy in the post-war world. The one among them was Oscar Lange, the famous Polish economist who, after returning home to serve the chairman of the Polish State Economic Council as India had the Planning Commission, suggested the and coined the concept of market socialism in 1950s. His idea of market socialism were cancelled by not only Poland but also by other state economies of the time. The peak of this type of planning was reached in China after the Cultural Revolution 1966 to 69, which led to an economic slowdown in the country, which had adopted a Soviet style central planning system after 1949. Under Deng Xiaoping 1977 to 97, China decentralized a great deal of economic power with its announcement of the open door policy in 1985 to save the economy. The Chinese open door policy was an initiative in the direction of the market socialism under the communist political design. A popular student demand for political reform in the favor of democracy was ruthlessly repressed in the Tiananmen Square in 1989. Similarly, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of the Mikhail Gorbachev, began a process of political and economic reforms called perestroika, that is restructuring, and glasnost, that is openness, in 1985 to save the failed economic experiments in the state economy. Other East European economies followed similar economic reforms from 1989 onwards. Thus, the whole world of the state economies had moved forward may market economy by the late 1980s. Since then, one of the countries have followed imperative planning, indicative planning. In the following 2 decades after the Soviet planning commenced, the idea of the planning received attention from the democratic world. A time came when some such economies started national planning, as they were neither state economy nor communist or socialist political system. The nature of their planning was different from the command economies. Such planning has been termed indicative planning by the economists and experts. The identifying feature of the indicative planning may be summed up as follows. First, every economy follow the indicative planning was mixed economy. Second, unlike a centrally planned economy, countries following imperative planning, indicative planning works through the market price system rather than replaces it. Third, side by side setting of a numerical or quantitative target similar to the practice in the imperative planning. A set of economic policy of indicative nature is also announced by the economists to realize the planned target. Fourth, the indicative nature of the economic policy which are announced in the such planning basically encourage or discourage the private sector in the process of economic decision making. After converting to mixed economy by mid 1940s, France commenced its first 6-year plan in 1947, which received a popularity as the Monet Plan. He was the first chairman of the General Planning Commission and the cabinet minister of the planning in France. Later, the Monet Plan became synonymous to the indicative planning. This plan is also sometimes described as the basic sector planning, as the government had selected 8 basic industries as the core of the development, in which the nature of the planning was almost imperative, that is, under the state monopoly. These sectors were owned by the private sector till 1944, and the France opted for their nationalization. Other economic activities were open for the private participation, wherein an indicative type of the policy planning was essential. France as well as Japan was followed indicative planning with a great success. It was in 1965 that the United Kingdom commenced such a planning. with the national plan and abandoned it in 1966 after being overtaken by events, a balance of payment crisis resulting in the deflationary package of the measure. Since then, the United Kingdom never opted for planning. Though the first use of the economic planning as an instrument of the economic process was carried out by the United States with the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1916 at the regional level, it never opted for the formal national planning. In 1940s, some economists had suggested in the favor of the use of national planning. We may have a reflex of indicative planning in the United States if we look at the presidential reports which come after the regular interval. These reports are just benchmark in the areas of resource utilization and governmental announcement of its objective, basically trying to motivate the private sector toward the area of public objectives. The indicative planning, which is practiced by the mixed economies growth target, can only be achieved once the public and the private enterprises worked in tandem. This is why, besides the plan target, the government need to announce some set of the indicative policy to encourage and motivate the private sector to accelerate their economic activities in the desired direction. After the Second World War, almost all of the newly independent countries adopted the route of the planned development, though they followed an overall model of the indicative planning. Many of them had a serious inclination toward the imperative planning. As in the case of India, the heavy base towards imperative planning could only be reformed once the process of economic reforms was started in 1991. Today, as there are mostly only mixed economies around the world, any country's development planning has to be only of the indicative type. After the revival of the role and the need market in promoting growth and development via Washington Consensus 1985, the World Trade Organization 1995, and the Santiago New Consensus 1998, only indicative planning has remained possible, with the state playing only a marginal role in the economy, especially in the area of social importance, that is nutrition, healthcare, drinking water, education, and the social security. Some other types. There are still many other type of planning depending upon the point of view we are looking at. For example, from the territorial point of view, planning could be regional or national. From the political point of view, planning could be central, state, or local. Similarly, the participatory point of view, planning has been categorized into centralized and decentralized. Again, from the temporal point of view, planning could be long term or short term in relative sense. Similarly, the planning can be sectoral and spatial also. While sectoral planning emphasizes the specific sector in the economy, that is agriculture, industry, or the services, in the spatial planning, the development is seen in the spatial framework, which aims at influencing the distribution of the people and activities in the spaces. One major classification of the planning which has been in use for the last few years is carried out on the basis of the value system of the society, systems, and normative planning. The system approach to planning is largely value neutral and remains fully focused on the economic aspect of the development. Socio-cultural variables are not given much importance in it and it quite mechanically targets the planned goals. This emerged as the most favored type of the planning across the world, as it was very much in the harmony with the idea of secularism, equality, and the democratic ideals of the modern time. The most important part of this approach was its neutrality to the social diversity. Such as an approach to planning suited India quite perfectly, as it had very high socio-cultural diversity. The normative approach of the planning is value based. The process of planning remains in the conformity to the value system of the target population, having quite a diversified approach to development. This approach of the planning was largely avoided by world and never tried at the macro level till the first decade of the 21st century. With the rising acceptance to the behavioral economics, we find normative approach gaining ground across the world. It received faster recognition among the experts and the policy makers after two major international events. Firstly, it was publication of the first World Happiness Report 2012, and secondly, the World Development Report 2015, World Bank, with the latter highlighting the importance and impact of including behavioral dimension of of people in formulating public policies. The case of India, the economic survey 2010-11 in the first document is the first document of the government of India which advocates the need of the normative approach to the planning in India. It is believed that until a program scheme run by the government is not able to connect with the custom tradition and ethos of the population, their acceptability will not be of the desired level among the target population. Establishing an empathic relationship between the programs or schemes and target population is now considered an important aspect in the planning and policy making. Such a change in the thinking is based on the experiences of India and the other countries of the world. In January 2015, the government of India replaced the erstwhile body Planning Commission by the Niti Aayog, a policy think tank. If we look into the function and guiding principle of the new body, we become aware of the fact that India has officially moved toward the normative planning. The new body has to follow the development model, which is all around, all pervasive, all inclusive, and holistic. In this process, the Niti Aayog has been further asked to enable the country to draw on the vitality and energy of the bedrock of our ethos, culture, and sustenance. In recent time, we see the government employing nudges to modify people's behavior to take desired socio-economic outcome aimed at development, that is, using behavioral insights to frame economic policies. All such policy actions are example of the normative planning. The Atmanirbharta, self-reliance push of the government is a value-laden idea with the local overtones such as vocal for local, blurring the lines between the nationalism and protectionism, and thus it guided the normative insights, be it aimed at emerging as a pharmacy of the world or exploring the possibility of alternatives to the global supply chain. ठीक है, इसी के साथ देखिए ये वाला चैप्टर कंप्लीट हो गया है, ये वाला है 4th चैप्टर हो गया है। अब इसके बाद 5th चैप्टर की बारी आएगी तो 5th चैप्टर कंप्लीट करेंगे। चलिए, तब तक के लिए वीडियो अच्छी लगी हो तो वीडियो को लाइक जरूर कर दीजिएगा और चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करके जल्दी जल्दी 100 सब्सक्राइबर तक पहुंचा दीजिए। चलिए ठीक है, मिलते हैं अगले वीडियो में। तब तक के लिए ध्यान रखिए और पढ़ाई को देखिए, तेज़ी से कीजिए। ठीक है, थैंक यू।